Hey everyone, I'm Alec, and welcome to another edition of MASL Midweek, where I break down the past and predict the future for all games in the Major Arena Soccer League. I'm going to try something a little bit different for this episode, and probably for the rest of the episodes this season. Instead of breaking down all of the games from the past week, I'm going to focus on the playoff picture and look at the games that had the biggest impact on that. So with that in mind, we'll start this episode off by having a look at last Wednesday's game where the San Diego Sockers hosted the Baltimore Blast and the Sockers won 5-1. This game really didn't mean all that much for the Sockers. Yes, the win was nice, as they always are, but the Sockers were already in a pretty good spot in the standings, so this win wasn't the biggest news. The game did, however, have bigger implications for the Blast as they went into their second game of the week at home against the Harrisburg Heat. Because the Blast lost to San Diego, the Heat came into this game half a game ahead of Baltimore for that final playoff spot in the Eastern Conference. And I thought they had a golden opportunity in this game to give themselves a bit of a cushion for that final spot. If they had won this game, they would have gone a game and a half ahead of the Blast in the standings, and they would have made it so that the Blast could not win the head-to-head tiebreaker between these two teams if they end up tied at the end of the season. So it was a really good opportunity for the Heat. An opportunity that they were not able to cash in on because the Blast won this one 7-4. So instead of Harrisburg going a game and a half ahead of the Blast leapfrogged the Heat to that fourth place spot in the Eastern Conference, the final playoff spot, and now hold a half game lead over Harrisburg. Now, Harrisburg is by no means dead. This was not ideal for them, but they're still very much alive and very much in contention for that final playoff spot. They're very much a threat for it as well. And as an indoor soccer fan, I think I kind of prefer that this happened. I think it makes the race a little bit tighter and a little bit more interesting moving forward. So I can't wait for the final piece of the season to see how that goes down. Speaking of that final playoff spot, let's talk a little bit about the Kansas City Comets, who on Sunday beat the visiting St. Louis Ambush 10-6, and in doing so gave themselves an 8-7 record. Now, I feel like this team has not been talked about as much as Baltimore and Harrisburg when it comes to the Eastern Conference playoffs, but they very much should be. This team has the same number of losses as Baltimore and Harrisburg, so at least mathematically, this team still has a great shot at making the playoffs. Now, speaking a little bit more practically, they have some very tough games ahead of them, so I'm not sure if they're going to be able to pull it off, but they definitely deserve to be in the conversation, and they're definitely a team you should keep your eye on. Then we'll wrap up our Eastern Conference tour by looking at the top part of the standings, because on Sunday, the third place Milwaukee Wave beat the first place Florida Tropics 6-5 in a game that went to overtime, and in doing so, made it to the top three spots in the Eastern Conference are now only separated by a couple of losses. You have Florida, Utica, and Milwaukee all up there, and all of them have a legitimate shot at getting that top spot in the Eastern Conference. Now, looking at the schedules that these three teams have, I think the advantage very much lies with Florida to get that top spot. But mathematically speaking, all three teams are very much alive to get the top spot in the East, and this is arena soccer. We all know it doesn't always go as expected. Hopping on over to the Western Conference, the Tacoma Stars split their Texas series. They won in Dallas, then they lost in Mesquite, which wasn't ideal for them, but not a disaster either. They're still only half a game out of the final playoff spot in the West, so not the biggest deal there. What's more interesting in the West is Ontario, who on Monday beat the San Diego Sockers 7-3 in Ontario. Ontario is starting to look pretty good. They're on a 3-game winning streak. They just beat San Diego, which is no small feat, and they now currently hold the final playoff spot in the Western Conference. So the Fury, they're sitting pretty, and this is a good time of the season to be doing so. Hey, Future Alec here with an additional comment for that. While the Fury are looking pretty good right now, they should definitely watch out for next week. You'll see what I mean when you get to my predictions. And now, back to the normal video. Meanwhile, for San Diego, a disturbing trend continued for them. Once again, on Monday, they lost to a playoff quality team on the road. and they've been doing a fair bit of that recently. And we'll see if that ends up being a problem for them. But for me, that does not bode well for the postseason at all. And if this trend continues, they could be in some serious trouble. And I think that will do it for my playoff breakdowns this week. Let's move on and predict some games for next week. We'll start off on Wednesday when Flash de Monterrey are hosting the Mesquite Outlaws. While the Outlaws are coming off a nice win over the Stars, I just don't think they're good enough to beat the Flash. I'm picking Monterrey. Then later that night, the Ontario Fury host the Dallas Psychics. The Psychics had some surprisingly competitive games last week against Utica and against Tacoma. Unfortunately for the Psychics, I think any momentum they got from those games will be squashed this week when they play the Red Hot Fury in Ontario. I'm picking the Fury. Then on Friday, we have a battle of the New York teams when the Rochester Lancers host Utica City FC. This rivalry is strictly geographic, at least for the time being, because for this season, Utica City has been so much better than Rochester, and I think that will be reflected in this game. I'm picking Utica. After that, the Baltimore Blast host the Orlando Seawolves. I think that Orlando's struggles will continue in this game. I'm picking the Blast. We then have the Milwaukee Wave visiting the Kansas City Comets. If the Comets had managed to keep last week's game in Milwaukee reasonably close, I would have been tempted to pick them this week, but they didn't. They got blown out by the Wave last week, so I'm going to pick the Wave this week. Then in Texas, the Mesquite Outlaws will host the San Diego Sockers. This game is kind of interesting because the Outlaws have played some very competitive games against some pretty good teams when the games have been played in Mesquite. Couple that with the fact that San Diego has had some struggles on the road as of late, and there's potential for an upset here. We'll go ahead and throw San Diego on upset watch for this game, but I'm too chicken to actually pick Mesquite in this game, so I'm going with the Sockers. The St. Louis Ambush will be hosting the Ontario Fury. This was a tough one for me to pick because Ontario has been so hot as of late, but I'm gonna pick the Ambush in this one because while they have not been as hot as Ontario has been lately, they're still a pretty good team. They're also playing at home in this one, and they're going to be playing on more rest than the Fury. Then finally for Friday, man, there's a lot of games on that day. The Turlock Cal Express will host the Dallas Sidekicks. The last time these teams played, the Express won fairly easily, and I think the same thing will happen this time. Then on Saturday, the Florida Tropics host Soles de Sonora. If this game was being played in Sonora, it would be a very interesting game and a very tough one to pick, at least for me. But since this game is being played in Florida instead, I'm pretty comfortable with picking the Tropics to win this game, but I still think that Sonora will make it very competitive and it will be a great game to watch. Then the Rochester Lancers host the Baltimore Blast. Poor Lancers, I'm picking the Blast. Then finally for Saturday, the Harrisburg Heat host the Orlando Seawolves. Poor Seawolves, I'm picking the Heat. Then on Sunday, we have another New York matchup, but this time Utica City FC will host the Rochester Lancers. Poor Lancers, I'm picking Utica. Then we have the St. Louis Ambush visiting the Milwaukee Wave. I think that St. Louis will be a thorn in Milwaukee's side during this game and make this game very tough on the Wave, but I ultimately think that the Wave will put their foot down in this one and not be upset by the Ambush again. I'm picking the Wave. Then the Kansas City Comets will host the Ontario Fury. I'm picking the Comets in this one, not so much because I think they're a better team, but because Ontario has such a tough travel schedule this week. I think it's going to be tough for them to win this one. Meanwhile, the Dallas Sidekicks will host the San Diego Sockers. I wouldn't be surprised if Dallas had another competitive game in this one, like they did last week against Utica and against Tacoma, but I would be very surprised if Dallas won, so I'm picking San Diego. Then for our final game this week, we have my game of the week, the Harrisburg Heat hosting the Baltimore Blast. This is my game of the week, mostly because of its playoff implications for that final spot in the Eastern Conference. I actually had a pretty easy time picking a winner in this one. I'm going to go with Harrisburg. While I do think that these teams are fairly evenly matched, Baltimore has a grueling travel schedule this weekend, and I think that will make this game very tough for them, and I think that Harrisburg will be able to take advantage of that, so I'm picking the Heat. And with that, I think we'll wrap up this edition of MASL Midweek, but make sure you come back next week for another new episode. In the meantime, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you next time.